Scripture reading this morning will be from Acts chapter 17, verse 18. Acts 17:18. And also some of the Epicurean and Stoic philosophers were conversing with him. Some were saying, "What would this idle babbler wish to say?" Others, "He seems to be a proclaimer of strange deities, because he was preaching Jesus and the resurrection."
I bet all of us have faced culture shock at one point or another. Even if you haven't traveled that much, you've probably been to a place where you say, "I'm not the one who belongs here." You kind of stand out a little bit. I've gotten to travel a little bit, and I thought I'd share a couple of situations. You probably can think of ones like this. I remember in Scotland, of course, they speak the same language, but I thought it was kind of odd. You don't have a beverage during the meal. They feed you this great meal and you're dying of thirst, and then they'd give you hot tea or hot coffee. It was kind of different, I thought. I got to be in Belgium one time, and these people, everybody speaking French and Dutch and all kinds of stuff. I didn't speak either, but this group came right up to me, this family, and asked me for directions in English, and they left. And I asked my friend, "How did they know I was American? How did they know I spoke English?" They said, "Your shoes. Nobody your age wears tennis shoes." And I thought, okay, it's kind of different. And then the last day I was visiting a friend in Warsaw, and we were out kind of shopping, and she spoke Polish, but I didn't. And this woman was walking down the sidewalk, and these little dogs were with her, and she didn't have any leashes or anything. They were just walking right at her feet. And I thought, well, that's pretty cool. I'm going to get one more picture here of something different. And I took a picture of her. She started talking to me, and then my friend started talking to her, and she was angry about something. And then it went on, and my friend started laughing, and the woman kind of left in a huff. And I said, "What happened?" She says, "Well, she said to you, don't take pictures of my dogs or there might be consequences." And so my friend started laughing, and she said, "He doesn't understand what you're saying. He doesn't speak Polish." And she said, "Well, you speak Polish." And she said, "But I'm not taking pictures of your dogs." So she got a kick out of that. Anyway, even within the States, I'm sure you're well aware, you can kind of tell where people are from, what state they're from. I remember years ago, a youth group was visiting where I was, and this girl said, "Y'all talk funny up here." And we kind of thought that was funny. Nobody thinks they have an accent. Everybody has an accent. We just don't realize it. You begin to feel like you're out of place. I thought I'd bring this up because Paul, I really feel for him. If you look at Acts 17, he felt pretty out of place, but it was for other reasons. He'd been assigned to deliver some very important information, as was just read for us. He was telling people that this man Jesus had come back from the dead. He had pulled it off, and he was setting up a rescue plan to get everyone out of here alive. And he ends up in Athens, and he was definitely a stranger in a strange land, felt very out of place. And it wasn't just a clash of cultures. He clashed because of ideas about what truth is. And I thought it might be helpful for us to look at that this morning. When he got there, he did probably what we would do. Maybe when you go visit someplace, is he walked around and looked at stuff. When you travel, I don't know if you notice, depends on where you go, there's the part that's presented to the tourists. And that's kind of interesting. But what's fun is to kind of go back behind that and find out about the real world behind all the stuff that's presented. So Paul does this little walking tour, and he's pretty upset. This is Acts 17, verse 16. He's kind of upset by what he sees. Here's Acts 17, starting at verse 16. "Now, while Paul was waiting for them at Athens, his spirit was being provoked within him as he was observing the city full of idols." So if you'd traveled back to Athens back then, and you were a tourist, when you got home and they asked you, "Well, how did it go? What did you think of Athens?" You'd say, "You know what? One thing about that place, they worship everything. They worship everything. You name it, they worship it." It's important when you read the Bible to try and see what's relevant to you. This is not just some story that's recorded. It's meant to teach us something, and I think it's pretty easy to see a connection here. I think we live kind of in a modern Athens. It's more subtle, but I believe that we live in a time and place where you name it, we worship it. And I looked up some things to see, and I'm sure you're well aware and have read some things of some of the beliefs that are kind of odd. And I don't want to make light of this. I just want you to be aware that just within this country alone, there are a variety of beliefs. Scientology, I'm sure you've heard of it. They basically believe that 75 million years ago, a spacecraft brought billions of people to Earth. That's the basic belief. The Temple of Psychic Youth, I'd not heard of them. They believe in magic and psychic abilities of the brain. The Church of All Worlds, I hadn't heard of them. They believe the earth itself is God, and they believe in fairies and gods of the ancient Greeks, like Paul was seeing at the time. And there's even something called the Church of Euthanasia, and they believe that we need to save the planet by to stop procreating, and they even encourage self-euthanasia. So these are things that are believed. I went to high school in Colorado Springs. I had some friends, a brother and a sister. They belong to the Baha'i faith, and that basically believes that Jesus is one of many prophets that all had the truth. All kinds of beliefs, and that's even before you get to what you might consider, quote, Christianity. Hundreds of different angles on the idea of worshiping the same God. I don't think it's a real stretch to say that we live in kind of a modern Athens. Not only is there a wild variety of things other than God, there's a variety of ideas about the real God. And when Paul saw this incredible variety, he talks to the people. This is what he says in verse 17. Acts 17:17, he talks to them and says what he does. So he was reasoning in the synagogue with the Jews and the God-fearing Gentiles, and in the marketplace every day with those who happened to be present. So he'd look for opportunities to chat about this situation. And notice that he's reasoning with them. I think that's one of the things kind of point out here. One thing that'll stand out right away, he was using logical thinking. It wasn't wishful thinking, it was reasoning, thoughtful analysis. Look at verse 18. This is what James read for us. Also some of the Epicurean and Stoic philosophers were conversing with him. Some were saying, what would this idle babbler wish to say? Others, he seems to be a proclaimer of strange deities because he was preaching Jesus and the resurrection. Paul begins talking rationally, and a lot of people don't like it. The Epicureans, even though people don't realize that they're around today, so to speak, their motto was, eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. That was Epicureanism. A Stoic, the best way to describe a Stoic was somebody who was like Spock. Very limited emotions. It's all about cold, rational life. Well, they call him an idle babbler. And all this talk about Jesus coming back from the dead, they thought this is crazy talk. But they want to hear more. Look at verse 19. And they took him and brought him to the Areopagus, saying, may we know what this new teaching is, which you are proclaiming. So this is kind of bizarre if you think about it. They go to him and ask him to speak in a building that's dedicated to the false god Ares or Mars. That's kind of the Greek version of that. It's like being asked to speak at a Baha'i temple. It's an odd position for him to be in. And the reason they want to hear Paul speak is for the very fact that he sounds strange to them. Acts 17:20. You can imagine how strange you'd have to sound in this city where everything's believed. But in Acts 17:20, here's what they say. For you are bringing some strange things to our ears, so we want to know what these things mean. Now, all the Athenians and the strangers visiting there used to spend their time in nothing other than telling or hearing something new. They were all about the latest, whatever is trending now. So you can imagine Paul had his work cut out for him. So how do you approach these people to teach them that there's one true God? Because that's not going to go over well in this city. They obviously preferred the smorgasbord approach. It's all good. Go to the church of your choice. It doesn't matter as long as you're sincere. That's probably what's going on in Athens. This is what Paul said that day while standing in a building built for a false god, surrounded by altars dedicated to false gods. This is what he said starting in verse 22. So Paul stood in the midst of the Areopagus and said, men of Athens, I observe that you are very religious in all respects. And this is great, because he could have started off with, what in the world are you thinking? But he doesn't. He could have said, look at this mess. Everything can't be true. That's not how it works. But instead he found common ground, something positive. I see that you're very religious. And he describes his walking tour. This is in verse 23, Acts 17:23. For while I was passing through and examining the objects of your worship, I also found an altar with this inscription: to an unknown God. Therefore, what you worship in ignorance, this I proclaim to you. It's kind of crazy. They actually had an altar honoring any of the gods that they might have overlooked, kind of a fill-in-the-blank religion. We also worship and adore your name here, is kind of what was going on. Paul could have ridiculed them for it, but he was very kind about it, and he led them in his rational thinking, and he used one of their own misconceptions to build an argument. And I'm going to paraphrase what he says. Basically, he said, it's funny you should think that out there's a God that you don't know, because I think you're right. There is a God who is unknown to you. Let me tell you about him. He's completely different than any of the other things that you're worshiping right now. Look at verse 24. Here's what he says the differences are. The God who made the world and all things in it, since he is Lord of heaven and earth, does not dwell in temples made with hands, nor is he served by human hands as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all people life and breath and all things. He's saying this one true God is not limited to temples, even though under the Old Testament, of course, there was a limited amount of his presence there. And of course, by this point, like today, the temple was any Christian. But the point Paul was making is this one true God is not limited to a structure, an altar, a church building. He doesn't depend on your help. In fact, it's completely the other way around. You are totally dependent on him. And he goes on to explain the one true God is overseeing everything. He is unlimited and fully involved. Look at verse 26. And he made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth, having determined their appointed times and the boundaries of their habitation. So he tells them about this one true God, and that this God is not aloof, but eager to help us. Look at verse 27. That they would seek God, if perhaps they might grope for him and find him, though he is not far from each one of us. So it's going to take effort to find the one true God. It's not as impossible as you might think, because our very existence depends on him. Look at verse 28. For in him we live and move and exist, as even some of your own poets have said, for we also are his children. So, being then that the children of God, we ought not to think that the divine nature is like gold or silver or stone, an image formed by the art and thought of man. He says it's not man-made stuff. So basically, comparing the one true God with all the other gods that are scattered throughout Athens, it's basically this. You didn't make God, he made you. That's the God we're talking about. That was one of the key differences in this city full of God makers. They invented gods that fit their preferences, gods that submitted to them, and Paul is very clear that's not how it really works. The one true God expects you to submit to him. Verse 30. Therefore, having overlooked the times of ignorance, God is now declaring to men that all people everywhere should repent. Repent means to turn around, to stop sinning. And he says ignorance is no longer an excuse. I think many people today believe, well, I can't be held accountable for stuff that I don't know. He's saying, no, the times of ignorance are over. Find out. And then he goes on to say this is a time-sensitive issue. Verse 31. Because he has fixed a day in which he will judge the world in righteousness through a man whom he has appointed, having furnished proof to all men by raising him from the dead. He's saying time is running out, and you'll be held to a standard, and that standard is Jesus, the man who came back from the dead. Now, when Paul finishes this, there's a variety of reactions. It's in verse 32. You'll notice at least three different reactions. Now, when they heard of the resurrection of the dead, some began to sneer. But others said, we shall hear you again concerning this. So Paul went out of their midst. But some men joined him and believed, among whom also were Dionysius the Areopagite and a woman named Damaris, and others with them. So some sneered, say, okay, yeah, right. Others were interested and say, not sure how I feel about this, I want to hear more. And others believed and joined him. And notice one of them was Dionysius the Areopagite. You know what that means? He used to worship Ares. He says, I'm beginning to see what you're saying here. So his rational approach convinced him. There's a whole lot of this that I think fits today, and I think it'll help understand our situation. Like verse 27 talks about groping for him and finding him, trying to find God. It's like looking in the dark. And I believe a lot of people aren't really looking that hard. I think people like the idea of there being a God, but I'm not sure everybody wants to actually find him, because then he might expect something from us. I believe that a lot of people like to be always in the process of reaching a conclusion. Not actually getting there, but always looking, and that way you're not accountable to anything. You probably know people at work or maybe at school where they're always the person that says, well, how's that project going? Say, yeah, it's coming along, and it's always in the process of getting done. That's why if we're presented with something hard and fast, a lot of times we don't like it. Some people sneered at Paul and didn't care for it. Others wanted to hear more. But notice he used logic, and you'll notice at one point they made fun of him earlier. They called him a name, and this is what I'd like to point your attention to. It's in verse 18. They make fun of him and they call him, you see this, an idle babbler. It says, what does this idle babbler wish to say? The original language is they call him, it literally means a seed picker. What does this seed picker have to say to us? And what it was based on the idea of a particular bird who would go around and look for shiny stuff and say, well, that's kind of interesting, and that's kind of interesting, and that was a seed picker, and that's what they're calling him. Someone who rummages around and collects bits and pieces of ideas. You know what's funny about them calling him that? That's them. Look at verse 21. Now all the Athenians and the strangers visiting there used to spend their time in nothing other than telling or hearing something new. They're the seed pickers. This is Seed Picker Central. That's all they do. And I think that's a good description of today. We love new stuff. When things become familiar, we move on. If it's not snappy enough. Most people are seed pickers. I think all of us are in danger of this. Our beliefs are built on scraps of ideas, various things, various shiny stuff that we've picked up along the way. Maybe something we read in a magazine and say, that sounds good. I believe that. Maybe a preacher or a relative or a teacher, a movie or a song. Say, yeah, that sounds true. I like that. And we pick up all these little pieces along the way. And then someday when somebody says, what do you believe? We hold up this patchwork. It's like a hideous quilt. Say, here's what I believe. I just kind of piece it together. And it's fragile, and it comes apart pretty easy. It's notorious where young people go to college or wherever, and their beliefs just fall apart because it's a bunch of different pieces barely holding together. That's why a lot of people, I believe, don't like to talk religion. They say, two things don't talk about: politics or religion. Don't talk about the two things that affect your life the most. Don't do that. And I think it's because deep down, I think a lot of us know that if we look too closely at these things, they won't hold together. It's an easy trap to fall into. Feels a lot like Christianity, but not really reliable and extremely fragile. And so we dodge conversations that deal with logic and why it falters in many cases. Real Christianity is made out of solid material. We don't tiptoe around it. That's why we get together for Bible class and doing what we're doing now. It's kind of like banging on it with a hammer, trying to find out what stands and what doesn't. Make sure it's real and secure. It's not anything that we have to be careful about. We look at it and we replace the stuff that doesn't ring true. I'm going to talk about one more place that Paul visited, and we'll wrap this up. It's actually in Ephesus, and it's in Acts 19. For the sake of time, I'll just kind of sum up what happens. Whereas before, he kind of got a little bit of a negative response with some sneering. In Ephesus, there's a riot over what he says. Almost got him killed. But in Acts 19, basically what happens is he presents the same information, and this guy named Demetrius makes money selling these false idols. And so he gets all the businessmen together, and they have a kind of a corporate meeting and say, this guy is ruining business, and plus as an afterthought, he says, plus, he's dishonoring the God that we're worshiping, the goddess. And so they start getting everybody riled up. And if about verse 23, you can start skimming here, and they gather everybody together. Verse 28, they start chanting, great is Artemis of the Ephesians. I don't know if you've ever seen a situation where a mob mentality kind of takes over. And they start grabbing people, and they go into the theater, and it's just out of control. Look at verse 30. This is Acts 19, verse 30. And when Paul wanted to go into the assembly, the disciples would not let him. Also, some of the Asiarchs who were friends of his sent to him and repeatedly urged him not to venture into the theater. So it's totally out of control. This huge crowd is chanting inside of a theater. It's incredibly dangerous. They keep Paul out of it. But there's next part. Every time I read it, it makes me laugh. Now imagine all these people are packed into this theater and they're all screaming and chanting together. Acts 19 verse 32. So then some were shouting one thing and some another. For the assembly was in confusion, and the majority did not know for what reason they had come together. I think that's a perfect description of religion today. Some are shouting one thing, some are shouting another. Most don't even know why they're there. Can you imagine that day? People raising their arms and chanting, saying, why are we here? I don't know. And they're just yelling. I guess they didn't have anything for lunch, so they go out and they join this group. I really think that's what's going on. Some people today are saying one thing, some are saying another. And if you pinpoint that, I think a lot of people don't even know exactly why they're there. We live in Athens, so to speak, but I also think we're kind of in Ephesus. There's lots of commotion. I think you would describe where we live as a very spiritual place. But a lot of ideas going back and forth, an incredible amount of different opinions. And it makes you wonder, what makes you any different? Aren't you just another voice in Athens? Just because you yell louder doesn't make you more right. You claim there's one true God. You might even claim, like Jesus did, that there's only one way to this one true God. What makes you any more than just another voice in Athens or another voice in the riot at Ephesus? Only saying you believe in something isn't enough. Not just being religious is enough. Sometimes I think about other people, because I've really tried to look at it myself. I've been around Christianity my whole life, and I think, okay, what are the odds that you just happen to be born into this and everything's cool? And I think about other people that have other beliefs. I think some of them get up every morning and live their day and they carry doubts. I think some of them do, knowing deep down that their beliefs are fragile. And I think that's why a lot of them fold when they're faced with a serious confrontation about what they believe. But I think some get up every morning and they feel just like you and I do, fully confident that their beliefs are solid. So what's the difference? Hopefully, the difference is I'm not a seed picker. I didn't collect my beliefs from scraps. I don't believe things just because my family believed them. And I'm not going to disbelieve because my family believed them, but that's not why I believe them. My beliefs aren't just because my church believes it, because I'm gathering with people of similar beliefs. My beliefs are not just based on wishful thinking. I think the one and only possible way that you can stand out in Athens is if you know what you're talking about by going to the Bible. That's your only distinction. And you might be amazed at how very, very few people, even those who say, yes, I'm a Christian, rarely open their Bibles. And I think that's really the only possible way to be different, to know for sure what you believe is built on something. If you look at Romans 1:21, here's the other option. I think there's only one other option. If you don't become a daily Bible reader and build your beliefs on something that's secure, by knowing what God has to say on things, this is your other option. Romans 1:21. For even though they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks, but they became futile in their speculations, and their foolish heart was darkened. If you don't go to the Word for answers, your only other option is this. You can guess. That's what speculation is. I think that's what most people are doing. We're just guessing and say, I hope this is true. I like it. I like the idea if it's true. But the only thing that will give you clarity is a strong devotion to the Bible. Not just to refute someone or to feel better. It's so you can survive. Matthew 4:4, you remember this? Jesus said this to Satan when he was confronted with him. Matthew 4, verse 4, but he answered and said, it is written, man shall not live on bread alone, but on every word that proceeds out of the mouth of God. In other words, if you want to survive, you're going to need more than physical food. You're going to need spiritual food, and that's the Word. You might think of it this way. This helps me. You and this book, the Bible, have the same author. It just makes sense that you would have some kind of connection with it in order to figure you out, to figure God out, and to figure out existence, period. It's proven to be a reliable source of truth, and it's the only thing that can keep you from being just the next person saying, I just believe this for no apparent reason, no rational thought. It's the only way to get out of Athens. Either you can use this book or you can guess. Reading the Bible will make all the difference to you. If you have not done that, if you've not made that decision, I would really encourage you to do that. Don't take my word for it. Read your Bible. It's so important. Don't take anybody's word for it. That will make you more than just the next religious person. You'll actually have solid footing. I think one of the reasons we get together as Christians like we're doing right now is we examine our beliefs to make sure it's built on truth and to make sure we're not seed pickers. Say, wait a second, I always thought this, but it's not true. I picked it up a long time ago, but it's just something shiny I picked up along the way. Before we close, I'm going to present the same message that Paul did back in Athens. It's Acts 17, verse 30, and this might be a good thought to be held in mind as we go our separate ways. It's Acts 17, verse 30. It says, therefore, having overlooked the times of ignorance, God is now declaring to men that all men everywhere should repent, because he has fixed a day in which he will judge the world in righteousness through a man whom he has appointed, having furnished proof to all men by raising him from the dead. It really is true. Jesus died, and he recovered from that death, and he arranged for you to be able to do the same by being baptized into his death. As the verse that Chris read for us, we put on Christ in baptism. You can get out of here alive. That's really good news. If you haven't made this choice, I want to remind you it is a time-sensitive issue. You are certainly welcome to make the decision before you leave. We're singing a song of encouragement, and you can make that known. You may be in a position to say, I need to hear more, and you also have that option. If you're a Christian, don't forget, beliefs must be based on truth, not on wishful thinking. But wherever you are right now in your search, I hope you'll think about this while we stand together and sing.
When the trumpet of the Lord shall sound and time shall be no more, and the morning breaks eternal, bright and fair, when the saved of earth shall gather over on the other shore, and the roll is called up yonder, I'll be there. When the roll is called up yonder, 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 I'll be there. On that bright and cloudless morning when